The mountains have a way of looking at you when you are not looking at them. They sit there jagged and indifferent like a row of broken teeth waiting for something soft to wander into their mouth. In Montana, the crazy mountains rise out of the earth with a particular kind of violence. They do not roll or invite you in with gentle slopes. They are a fortress of granite and scree a place where the air gets thin and the logic of the valley floor starts to unravel. People go there to find themselves or to find elk, but sometimes the mountains find them first. I have spent a lifetime staring into the black holes of missing persons reports, and the case of Aaron Hedges is one that stays in the marrow of my bones. It is a story about a man who knew exactly what he was doing until the world around him decided to stop following the rules. There is a specific kind of silence that happens just before things go wrong. A weight in the atmosphere that suggests you are no longer the apex predator in the woods. Aaron Hedges was 38 years old in September of 2014. He was not a weekend warrior or a city boy with a brand new compass he did not know how to read. He was a hunter, a man built of sinew and experience, someone who understood the rhythmic demands of the backcountry. He was supposed to be on a simple trip with his friends, a week of elk hunting in the high country. They had a plan, a cache of supplies, and the kind of confidence that comes from years of successful excursions. But the mountains do not care about your resume. On the 7th of September, Aaron decided to take a different route than his companions. He was heading toward a place called Sunlight Lake to meet up with them at a base camp. He had his gear, his radio, and his senses. But somewhere between point A and point B, the map of reality began to tear at the edges. The climb towards Sunlight Lake is a brutal ascent, a vertical tax on the lungs and the knees. Aaron was carrying a heavy pack, the straps probably biting into his shoulders as he navigated the switchbacks. Imagine the smell of damp pine and the sharp metallic tang of the mountain air as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The temperature in the Crazies can drop 30 degrees in the blink of an eye, turning a pleasant hike into a survival situation. When Aaron did not show up at the camp, his friends did not panic immediately. Hunters are often delayed by the terrain or the pursuit of game. But as the first night bled into the second, and the silence on the radio became a physical presence, the dread began to set in. They called for help, and the machinery of a modern search and rescue operation began to grind into gear. They expected to find a man with a twisted ankle, or perhaps someone hunkered down under a spruce tree waiting out a storm. They did not expect to find a ghost story. The search was massive. We are talking about helicopters with infrared sensors, dog teams that could sniff out a needle in a haystack, and dozens of experienced woodsmen scouring every square inch of the trail. They flew over the drainages and the ridges, searching for the orange glow of a campfire or the reflective glint of a survival mirror. Nothing. The infrared saw only the cold heat of the earth and the occasional movement of a deer. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply evaporated into the thin mountain air. Then the weather turned. A massive snowstorm rolled in, dumping feet of white powder over the search area, burying any tracks and muffling the world in a cold, suffocating blanket. The search had to be scaled back. The mountains had slammed the door shut. It would be a long time before the Crazies decided to give anything back. Months later, when the snow finally began to retreat and the world turned from white to a muddy, bruised gray, a discovery was made that defied every law of wilderness survival. A pair of boots was found. Not just any boots, but the boots Aaron Hedges had been wearing. They were found miles away from his last known location, sitting on a ridge in an area that had been searched multiple times. They were not scuffed or torn as if they had been dragged there by a predator. They were just sitting there as if he had stepped out of them and kept walking. Think about that for a second. Try to feel the texture of the frozen ground against your bare socks. No one who knows the mountains takes off their boots in the middle of a sub-zero wilderness unless they have lost their mind or unless something has convinced them that they no longer need feet to walk. The boots were found in a direct line of sight to a ranch house far below in the valley, a place Aaron could have easily reached if he had just kept going down. But he did not go down. The anomalies did not stop at the footwear. Later searchers found his backpack and his hydration bladder. The pack was leaning against a tree almost neatly, as if he had just stepped away for a moment to answer the call of nature. But the items inside were scattered in a way that suggested a frantic, disjointed state of mind. His thermal clothing was there. His fire-starting kit was there. All the things a man needs to stay alive in the cold were left behind while he wandered deeper into the high country in his stocking feet. There is a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where a person in the final stages of hypothermia feels a burning heat and strips off their clothes, but this was different. This felt like a shedding of a skin. It felt like someone being lured away by a voice only they could hear, leaving the heavy burdens of the physical world behind. The distance between where the pack was found and where the boots were located made no sense for a man who was supposed to be dying of exposure. The terrain in that part of the Crazy Mountains is a labyrinth of deadfall and boulders. To move through it without shoes is a feat of agonizing endurance. Every step would be a puncture, every movement a scream of nerves against the sharp edges of the granite. And yet the evidence suggested Aaron moved miles across this landscape. He bypassed cabins where he could have found shelter. He ignored the lights of the valley. He seemed to be moving with a singular, terrifying purpose toward the highest, most inhospitable peaks. It is as if the mountains were a giant magnet, and the iron in his blood was being pulled toward the center of the mass. We talk about the missing as if they are lost, but in cases like this, it feels more like they are being harvested. There is a precision to the way the gear is found, a breadcrumb trail that leads nowhere but deeper into the mystery. It was not until the following year that the final piece of the puzzle was found. His remains were discovered by a local landowner in a place that had been searched by air and on foot multiple times. He was found near a cache of old equipment miles and miles away from where he should have been, in a location that required him to cross multiple ridges and valleys that would challenge a healthy, fully geared hiker in broad daylight. He was found in a spot that felt like a dead end. The autopsy could not provide a clear cause of death due to the passage of time and the elements. There were no signs of animal predation on the bones at the time of death. No broken limbs that would explain a fall. Just a man, or what was left of him, sitting in the high, lonely silence of a mountain that had finished with him. The more you look at the map of his final movements, the more it looks like a series of impossible leaps. What happens to a man's mind when the woods turn sour? There are theories that go beyond the standard explanations of dehydration or altitude sickness. Some people talk about infrasound, low-frequency vibrations caused by wind rushing through specific rock formations that can cause feelings of dread, nausea, and total disorientation. It can make a man run from a ghost or walk toward a cliff. Others talk about something older. Something that lives in the places where the light does not quite reach the forest floor. There is a pattern in these. Missing 411 cases. The victim is often an experienced male. They are near water or high peaks. A sudden storm moves in to mask the disappearance, and their gear is found in places that defy logic. It is a formula for a nightmare. Aaron Hedges fits every single one of those criteria. He was a capable man who was reduced to a set of bones in the dirt. And the mountains are not talking. I think about the boots often. I think about the moment he decided to unlace them. Was he looking at the lights of the ranch below? Did he feel the cold, or was he already somewhere else? There is a specific kind of microscopic observation you have to apply to these scenes. The way a zipper is half pulled, the way a canteen is left uncapped. These are the frantic signatures of a man who is no longer in control of his own narrative. The Crazy Mountains are a place of high energy and low mercy. The locals have stories that go back generations, stories of lights in the sky and people who walk into the trees and never come out, or who come out changed. Aaron did not come out. He became part of the geography. His story is a warning that the wilderness is not a park. It is a hungry, ancient entity that sometimes decides to reach out and take a piece of us, just to remind us who truly owns the earth. The investigation into Aaron Hedges ended because there was nothing left to investigate. The paperwork was filed, the remains were buried, and the mountains moved on to the next season. But, for those of us who look at the data, the case remains an open wound. You cannot explain away the distance he traveled without shoes. You cannot explain how he was missed by infrared cameras in an open area. You cannot explain why a man would leave his survival gear behind when the snow began to fall. These are the gaps where the shadows live. We like to believe that we are safe because we have satellites and cell phones and nylon tents, but those things are just toys to a mountain range that has been standing for 50 million years. When the mountains decide to change the rules, your gear is just a collection of plastic and metal that will be found by a stranger a year later. The conclusion of the Hedges case leaves us with a chilling realization. We are only ever guests in the wild, and our stay can be revoked at any moment for reasons we will never understand. Aaron was a hunter who became the hunted not by a bear or a lion, but by something far more subtle and pervasive. He was led on a journey that took him out of his boots, out of his clothes, and eventually out of his life. The mountains do not have a conscience. They only have a stomach. And as long as people continue to walk into the high country with the belief that they are in charge, the mountains will continue to feed. The mystery of what happened in those final hours is a secret kept by the granite and the wind, a secret that Aaron Hedges took with him into the long, cold dark. This pattern of impossible travel and discarded gear is not unique to the Crazy Mountains. Consider the disappearance of Keith Parkins in 1952, a 2-year-old boy who vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Ritta, Oregon. He was found 19 hours later, nearly 12 miles away, having crossed multiple mountain ridges and fences that an adult would struggle to navigate in that time frame. He was found alive, face down in the snow, in a location that defied every physical possibility for a child of his age. Like Hedges, the movement was too fast, too far, and through terrain that should have been impassable. These cases suggest that there are forces at work in our wilderness that do not operate on a human scale of time or distance. We are walking through a world we do not fully understand, and sometimes the world reaches out and pulls us in. Stay on the trail, keep your boots laced tight, and never, ever think that you are alone in the woods. The coffee in my mug has gone cold for the 3rd time tonight, and the steam has long since stopped dancing in the dim light of my desk lamp. I find myself staring at the same crime scene photos of the Crazy Mountains in Montana. They call them the Crazies for a reason. It is not just the jagged profile of the peaks, or the way the weather can turn from a mild autumn afternoon to a blinding whiteout in the span of a single breath. It is something deeper. Something etched into the very stones that make up that range. The investigation into Aaron Hedges ended because there was simply nothing left for the human mind to process. The paperwork was filed in those heavy steel cabinets that hold the secrets of the lost, and the remains were buried in a quiet plot where the grass grows thick and indifferent. The mountains moved on to the next season as if they had never noticed the frantic searchers or the sound of the helicopters. But for those of us who spend our lives looking at the data and staring into the gaps of these stories, the case remains an open wound that refuses to scar over. You cannot explain away the distance that man traveled without his boots. You cannot rationalize the physics of a human being moving through miles of deadfall and waist-deep snow while his feet are bare and exposed to the biting frost. We look at the maps, and we see the lines drawn by the investigators. They are neat and logical. But the ground itself is never logical. The Crazy Mountains are a fortress of granite and scree where the wind screams through the pines like a choir of the damned. Aaron Hedges was not a novice. He was a hunter who knew the weight of his pack and the importance of his gear. He was a man who understood that in the high country your equipment is your skin. And yet the evidence shows us a man who shed that skin piece by piece as if he were being unmade by the very air he breathed. You cannot explain how he was missed by infrared cameras in an open area where a human heat signature should have glowed like a flare against the cold earth. The search teams were thorough, and they were professional. They had the best technology that money and desperation could provide. And yet Aaron was a ghost in the machine. He moved through the search grids like a whisper through a graveyard. You cannot explain why a man would leave his survival gear behind when the first flakes of snow began to fall. These are the gaps where the shadows live. These are the places where our understanding of human behavior fails and something else takes over. We like to believe that we are safe because we have satellites orbiting our heads and cell phones in our pockets and nylon tents that promise to keep the world at bay. We think our GPS coordinates and our Gore-Tex jackets make us masters of the wilderness. But those things are just toys to a mountain range that has been standing for 50 million years. The mountains do not care about your battery life or your emergency whistle. They have seen empires rise and fall, and they have seen 1,000 men just like Aaron Hedges walk into the trees with a sense of purpose only to be swallowed by the silence. When the mountains decide to change the rules, your gear is just a collection of plastic and metal and colorful fabric that will be found by a stranger a year later. It becomes a marker of failure, a signpost for the next person who thinks they are in charge. The conclusion of the Hedges case leaves us with a chilling realization that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. We are only ever guests in the wild, and our stay can be revoked at any moment for reasons we will never understand. Aaron was a hunter who became the hunted. I do not mean he was pursued by a grizzly bear or a mountain lion. Those are things we can understand. Those are predators with teeth and claws and biological needs. Aaron was hunted by something far more subtle and pervasive. He was led on a journey that took him out of his boots and out of his clothes and eventually out of his life. Think about the physical sensation of walking on frozen ground without shoes. Think about the sharp edges of the rocks and the way the cold drains the warmth from your marrow until your bones feel like glass. And yet he kept moving. He moved uphill. He moved across ridges that should have been impassable. He was being pulled by a thread that we cannot see. A call that only he could hear. The mountains do not have a conscience. They do not feel guilt or pity or remorse. They only have a stomach. And as long as people continue to walk into the high country with the arrogance of the modern age, the mountains will continue to feed. The mystery of what happened in those final hours is a secret kept by the granite and the wind. It is a secret that Aaron Hedges took with him into the long and cold dark. When they finally found his remains, they were in a place that defied the logic of the search. His boots were found miles away, in a different direction. His backpack was tucked away as if he were just stepping away for a moment. But he never came back. The searchers looked at the terrain, and they shook their heads because the math did not add up. The calories required to move that distance in that weather do not exist in the human body. The endurance required to withstand the elements without protection is not something taught in any survival manual. It is as if he were being transported or assisted by a force that operates on a different frequency than our own. We see this pattern over and over again in the files. The discarded clothing, the impossible distances, the strange locations of the remains. It is a recurring nightmare that the National Park Service and the local sheriffs would rather we did not talk about. This pattern of impossible travel and discarded gear is not unique to the Crazy Mountains. It is a thread that runs through the history of our wilderness areas like a vein of black quartz. Consider the disappearance of Keith Parkins in 1952. He was a 2-year-old boy who vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. One moment he was there and the next he was gone. The search began almost immediately. This was not a man with a rifle and a pack. This was a toddler in a jacket and dungarees. He was found 19 hours later, nearly 12 miles away from the ranch. To reach that spot, the boy had to cross multiple mountain ridges and navigate through fences and dense brush that an adult man would struggle to move through in that time frame. He was found alive, face down in the snow, in a location that defied every physical possibility for a child of his age. Like Hedges, the movement was too fast and too far, and through terrain that should have been a wall of thorns and stone. How does a 2-year-old survive a night in the sub-zero Oregon wilderness and travel 12 miles over mountains? The answer is that he does not. Not by himself. These cases suggest that there are forces at work in our wilderness that do not operate on a human scale of time or distance. We are walking through a world we do not fully understand, and sometimes the world reaches out and pulls us in. We look at the trees, and we see lumber and shade, but something else sees a playground. We look at the mountains and we see a challenge or a photo opportunity, but something else sees a pantry. There is a thinness to the air in certain places, a feeling that the reality we know is just a veil draped over something much older and much hungrier. Aaron Hedges walked through that veil, and he never found his way back. He became part of the mountain, part of the statistics that we try to explain away with terms like paradoxical undressing or terminal burrowing. But those words are just comfort food for the skeptical. They do not explain the boots. They do not explain the distance. They do not explain the silence that falls over the woods when you realize you are no longer at the top of the food chain. I think about Aaron a lot when the sun goes down and the shadows start to stretch across my office wall. I think about the moment he realized his boots were no longer on his feet. I think about the look in his eyes when he saw the peaks of the Crazies glowing in the moonlight and realized that the mountains were moving while he was standing still. There is a vibration in the ground in those high places. A low hum that you can only hear when your heart rate slows and the fear begins to take hold. It is the sound of the earth breathing. It is the sound of the machine that processes us when we wander too far from the path. We are told to stay on the trail, and we are told to keep our boots laced tight. We are told to bring a map and a compass and a friend. But sometimes none of that matters. Sometimes the trail disappears under your feet, and the map turns into a blank sheet of paper, and your friend becomes a stranger you do not recognize. The files are full of stories like this. Stories of people who were here 1 second and gone the next. People who were found in places they could not have reached, or who were never found at all. We tell ourselves that there is always a rational explanation because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. We would rather believe in a serial killer or a rogue bear than believe in a mountain that can move a man 10 miles in a night without his shoes. We would rather believe in a lapse of judgment than a lapse in the laws of physics. But the data does not lie. The numbers are cold and they are hard, and they point to a reality that we are not prepared to face. The wilderness is not a park. It is not a sanctuary. It is a vast and ancient entity that has its own agenda and its own methods of collection. When you go out there into the deep woods or the high peaks, remember Aaron Hedges. Remember the boots left in the snow and the backpack leaning against a tree. Remember the distance that cannot be measured in miles, but in the sheer impossibility of the journey. The world is a much stranger place than the brochures would have you believe. There are things in the shadows that do not have names, and there are places where the light of the sun does not seem to reach even at high noon. We are small and we are fragile, and our lives are just a flicker in the eyes of the granite. The next time you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, or that sudden urge to run when there is nothing behind you, do not ignore it. That is your instinct trying to tell you that the veil is thinning. That is your soul recognizing the predator that does not leave tracks. The case of Aaron Hedges will never truly be closed in the minds of those who know the details. It will remain a ghost in the system, a reminder of what happens when the wild decides to take back what it thinks belongs to it. We are all just visitors, and the rent is higher than we can afford to pay. So stay on the trail and keep your boots laced tight. Do not look too long into the dark between the trees, and never ever think that you are alone in the woods, because something is always watching, and something is always waiting for the moment you decide to take off your boots and walk into the snow. The mountains are hungry, and the winter is long, and the secrets of the crazy mountains are written in bones that no one will ever find. The pattern is there if you are willing to see it. It is a pattern of silence and of shadow. It is the story of Keith Parkins in Oregon, and Aaron Hedges in Montana, and 1,000 others whose names are fading on the pages of old newspapers. They all shared a moment where the world stopped making sense, and the rules of the earth were rewritten just for them. They were all led into the deep places, where the air is cold, and the wind sounds like a voice calling your name. We are not the masters of this planet. We are just the latest in a long line of guests who have overstayed their welcome. The mountains are patient. They can wait for us to make a mistake. They can wait for us to forget who truly owns the earth. And when we do, they will be there to remind us in the only way they know how, by taking a piece of us and burying it where the sun never shines. Stay safe out there. The woods are deeper than you think, and the shadows are longer than they appear. Keep your eyes on the horizon and your ears open to the wind. And if you ever find yourself standing in the middle of a clearing with no memory of how you got there and your boots are nowhere to be found, do not scream. No one is coming to help you. The mountains have already decided your fate, and the story is already written in the stone. You are just the latest chapter in a book that has no end. The long, cold dark is waiting, and it has plenty of room for one more. The investigation into the disappearance of Jaryd Atadero in 1999 follows a similar chilling trajectory. A 3-year-old boy who vanished on a trail in the Comanche Peak wilderness of Colorado while walking just feet ahead of a group of adults. Despite a massive search involving hundreds of people and high-tech equipment, his remains were not found until 4 years later, and 550 feet higher than where he disappeared, on a steep and rugged cliff face that would be difficult for an experienced climber to reach. His clothing was found in a condition that suggested it had been placed there rather than fallen, and his shoes were remarkably well preserved, despite the passage of time and the elements. Like Hedges and Parkins, the location of the recovery defied the physical capabilities of the victim and the thoroughness of the initial search teams. These cases are not isolated incidents, but part of a terrifying tapestry of the unknown that blankets our wild places. We are not alone, and we are not safe, and the mountains are always watching,